The sun rose over Rome on the 24th day of August, in the year 410, and the city did not know it was the last morning of the world it had built. The walls still stood. The aqueducts still carried water from distant hills. The forum still bore the names of emperors carved in marble, though many of those emperors were dead or forgotten, and the empire's treasury had been hollow for longer than most could remember. This was the fall of Rome, though no one yet called it that. This was the collapse of the Roman Empire, though the word collapse suggests a single moment, and empires do not fall like towers. They erode, they empty, they become shadows of their own legends until the shadow is all that remains. The Visigoths had been at the gates for 3 days. Before that, they had been allies, enemies, wanderers, and weapons in Rome's own hands. For decades, the empire had used them, paid them, promised them land and gold and legitimacy. The Visigoth invasion was not born from savage ambition, but from broken oaths and empty coffers. Their king, Alaric, had served Rome as a general, had bled for Rome's wars, had asked only for what Rome had promised and never delivered. He had marched his people across mountains and rivers, had negotiated and waited and demanded, and Rome had given him nothing but contempt and delay. The empire's gold had lost its meaning long before the city lost its walls. Corruption had hollowed the state from within. Taxes fell heaviest on those with the least. The economy of the ancient world had fractured into 1,000 desperate transactions. Trade routes collapsed under the weight of debt and fear. Soldiers went unpaid. Grain shipments ceased. Inflation devoured savings. The wealth of centuries had been spent on civil wars and palaces and the maintenance of an illusion. So Alaric came not as a barbarian, but as a creditor. He came with an army of the displaced, the betrayed, the hungry. His people had been given a choice by Rome, starve or fight. They chose to fight. They surrounded the eternal city in the heat of summer, and the Romans inside looked at their walls and believed, as they always had, that walls were enough. The Visigoths did not need to break the walls. They needed only to wait. Rome was a city of over 1 million souls, and it had not been designed to feed itself under siege. The granaries were low. The aqueducts could be cut. The roads that had once carried the wealth of the world into the city now carried nothing. For days the Romans watched from the parapets as the Gothic camp spread like a second city outside their own. Fires burning through the night, voices singing in languages the Romans did not understand. Some said the gates would hold. Some said reinforcements were coming from Ravenna, where the Emperor Honorius hid in his palace, surrounded by marshes and delusions of safety. The reinforcements never came. Honorius sent prayers, not soldiers. He sent assurances, not grain. Inside the city, the streets grew tense with whispers. Bread became scarce. The markets, once loud with the haggling of merchants from every corner of the ancient world, fell silent. The weight of a coin meant nothing when there was nothing left to buy. Families hoarded what little they had. The wealthy barricaded their estates. The poor gathered in the shadow of the great monuments and wondered if stone could save them. Roman soldiers stood on the walls and looked down at the Gothic host and felt the slow creep of inevitability. These were not the legions of old. These were men who had not been paid in months, who wore armor inherited from their fathers, who understood that the empire they defended was already a ghost. On the third night, someone opened the Salarian gate. History does not remember the name. Perhaps it was a slave seeking freedom. Perhaps it was a traitor seeking gold. Perhaps it was simply someone who understood that the siege would end one way or another, and that mercy might be found in surrender rather than starvation. The gate opened in darkness, and the Visigoths poured through like water through a crack in a dam. The sound came first. Not horns or war cries, but the thunder of thousands of feet on stone. The Romans on the walls heard it before they saw it, a rumbling that rose from the earth and shook the foundations of the ancient city. Then the shouts began. Voices in Gothic, in Latin, in panic. Soldiers stumbled from their posts. Civilians woke to the sound of iron and fire. The Visigoths surged through the Salarian gate and into the streets, and Rome, which had not fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years, began to burn. The battle was not a battle. It was a flood. The Visigoths came in waves, not as a disciplined army, but as a torrent of rage and need. They had waited too long. They had been denied too many times. They poured into the Forum, into the Subura, into the neighborhoods where the wealthy had built their marble palaces and the poor had carved out lives in the shadow of grandeur. Roman soldiers tried to form lines in the narrow streets, tried to hold intersections and bridges, but the city had not been designed for defense from within. Every alley was a trap. Every corner was a blind turn. The Visigoths knew the city as well as the Romans did. They had been camped outside its walls for days, studying its angles, waiting for this moment. Fire bloomed in the darkness. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in pockets of rage. Buildings that had stood for centuries became kindling. The flames climbed the walls of insulae, the tenement blocks where the poor lived stacked upon one another like stones in a cairn. Families fled into the streets and found themselves caught between the fire behind them and the swords ahead. The smoke rose thick and black, blotting out the stars, turning the night into a choking twilight. The air tasted of ash and iron. The heat was unbearable. Windows shattered. Roofs collapsed. The sound of breaking stone mixed with the screams of those who could not escape. In the Forum Romanum, where emperors had once given speeches and senators had debated the fate of the world, Gothic warriors shattered statues and tore down banners. They moved through the sacred heart of the city with the efficiency of men who had been soldiers before they were enemies. They looted temples and smashed altars, not because they hated Rome's gods, but because they no longer feared them. The gods of Rome had failed. The gods of Rome had watched as the empire hollowed itself out, as corruption and greed and arrogance replaced discipline and honor. The Visigoths took what they wanted. They took gold. They took silver. They took anything that could be carried or sold or melted down. They were not interested in Rome's history. They were interested in survival. Roman soldiers fought in the streets, but they fought without hope. They knew the city was lost. They knew the empire had abandoned them. Some fought because they did not know what else to do. Some fought because they still believed in the idea of Rome, even as that idea crumbled around them. Most died in the dark, in alleys whose names would be forgotten, their bodies left where they fell. There were no lines of battle, no formations, no discipline. There was only chaos. There was only the sound of steel on steel, the wet thud of blades finding flesh, the cries of the wounded echoing off stone walls that had witnessed 1,000 years of triumph and now witnessed the wealthy barricaded themselves in their villas and waited for the storm to pass. Some offered gold to the Visigoths in exchange for mercy. Some received it. Some did not. The gates of grand estates were smashed open, and the treasures inside were dragged into the streets. Silk from the East, spices from Africa, wine from Gaul, art from Greece. Everything the empire had gathered over centuries, everything it had taken from the world, was now being taken from it. The irony was lost on no one. Rome had built itself on conquest and plunder, and now it was being conquered and plundered in turn. The cycle had simply come full circle. In the Subura, the ancient slum where the poorest Romans lived, the violence was different. Here there were no palaces to loot, no treasures to steal. Here the Visigoths found only people like themselves, the hungry, the desperate, the forgotten. Some Romans joined them, some fought them. Most simply hid and prayed for morning. Children clung to their mothers in the darkness. Old men sat in doorways and watched the smoke rise, and remembered when Rome had been strong, or thought they did. Memory is unreliable in moments of collapse. The mind rewrites history to make sense of the present. The Romans told themselves that this was temporary, that order would return, that the empire would rise again. They had to believe it. The alternative was unthinkable. The Visigoths moved through the city like a river finding its course. They took the Aventine Hill. They took the Capitoline. They took the Palatine, where emperors had lived and ruled and dreamed of eternity. The palaces were empty. The emperors were gone, hiding in Ravenna or dead or irrelevant. The Visigoths walked through marble halls that still smelled of incense and wine, and they took what they wanted and left the rest. They were not interested in ruling Rome. They were interested in justice. They were interested in compensation for years of broken promises. They were interested in food and gold and survival. They were not monsters. They were men who had been pushed too far. By dawn, the city was theirs. The fires still burned. The smoke still rose. The streets were littered with bodies and broken pottery, and the shattered remnants of an empire that had believed itself eternal. The Visigoths controlled the gates. They controlled the granaries. They controlled the treasury, though the treasury was nearly empty. They controlled Rome, and Rome had never felt smaller. The sun rose on the 25th of August, and the city was silent in a way it had never been silent before. The sounds of 1 million people living and working and arguing and selling and praying had been replaced by the crackle of dying fires and the low moans of the wounded. The streets were empty. The forums were empty. The great monuments stood untouched, because even the Visigoths understood that some things were too large to destroy, too old to erase. The Colosseum still stood. The Pantheon still stood. The aqueduct still carried water, though no one dared to collect it. Rome had not been destroyed. It had been broken. There is a difference. Survivors emerged from their hiding places like ghosts. They moved through the streets slowly, carefully, afraid of what they might find. They found bodies. They found ash. They found the wreckage of shops and homes and temples. They found a city that looked like Rome, but felt like something else entirely. The grandeur was still there, but it was hollow now. A stage set without actors. The survivors did not speak. They simply looked. They bore witness. They tried to understand what had happened and failed, because what had happened was too large for understanding. The world they had known was gone. The empire that had defined their lives had revealed itself to be fragile, temporary, mortal. In the alleyways, women searched for their children. Old men searched for their sons. The wounded crawled toward water or shade or any promise of relief. The dead were everywhere, Roman and Goth alike, their bodies already beginning to bloat in the summer heat. Flies gathered. Dogs emerged from hiding and began to feed. The city stank of death and smoke and something else, something harder to name. It was the smell of endings. It was the smell of history folding in on itself. The Visigoths did not celebrate. They moved through the city with the exhaustion of men who had fought for something and won it and discovered that winning was not enough. They gathered in the forums and divided their plunder. They argued over who deserved what. They tended to their wounded. They burned their dead. They had taken Rome, but they had not taken safety. They had not taken peace. They had taken a city that could not feed them, could not shelter them, could not promise them anything but more struggle. Alaric stood in the forum and looked at the ruins of the empire that had betrayed him, and whatever satisfaction he felt was tempered by the knowledge that victory had solved nothing. His people were still homeless. They were still hungry. They were still at war with a world that had no place for them. Some of the Romans who had survived began to leave the city. They gathered what they could carry and walked out through the broken gates, heading north or south or anywhere that was not here. They left behind homes that had belonged to their families for generations. They left behind memories and possessions and the graves of their ancestors. They left because staying meant starvation or slavery or death. The roads out of Rome were crowded with refugees, and the refugees moved in silence, their faces blank with shock. They did not look back. Looking back would have been unbearable. Others stayed. They stayed because they had nowhere else to go, or because they still believed Rome could recover, or because they were too old or too sick to leave. They began to clean the streets. They began to bury the dead. They began the slow, painful work of survival. They scavenged food from abandoned homes. They drew water from the aqueducts. They avoided the Visigoths when they could, and traded with them when they could not. A new economy emerged in the ruins, an economy based on barter and desperation. A loaf of bread was worth a silver cup. A jug of wine was worth a silk robe. Nothing had the value it once had. Everything had been reduced to its most basic function. Can this keep me alive? The Visigoths stayed in Rome for 3 days. 3 days of looting and burning and occupation. 3 days that shattered the myth of Roman invincibility forever. On the 3rd day, Alaric gave the order to leave. He understood that staying would accomplish nothing. The city was broken. The empire was broken. There was nothing left to take and nowhere to go but forward. The Visigoths gathered their plunder and their people and marched south toward Calabria, toward the hope of ships and a crossing to Africa and the possibility of land where they might finally rest. They left Rome behind them, and Rome did not try to stop them. The Romans who remained watched the Gothic army depart and felt no relief, only the numb weight of survival. The city was theirs again, but it was not the same city. It would never be the same city. The walls were intact, but the illusion was shattered. Rome had fallen, not permanently, not completely, but undeniably. The eternal city had proven itself mortal. In Ravenna, the Emperor Honorius learned of the fall 3 days after it happened. He was said to have been relieved at first, believing the messenger was speaking of a prized chicken he kept, also named Rome. When he understood the truth, he did nothing. He sent no army. He made no proclamation. He retreated further into his palace and his delusions, leaving the city to fend for itself. The empire continued in name, but it was an empire in form only, a hollow shell sustained by inertia and the refusal to admit what everyone already knew. The weeks that followed were harder than the siege. The city struggled to feed itself. Disease spread through the streets, carried by rats and unwashed bodies and contaminated water. The population shrank. Some died, some left, some simply disappeared into the ruins and were never seen again. The great families who had ruled Rome for generations found their power broken. Their estates had been looted. Their gold had been taken. Their influence had been revealed as an illusion. Some adapted. Some did not. The old order was dying and the new order had not yet been born. Trade did not return. The roads were dangerous. The seas were controlled by pirates. The provinces were slipping away, declaring independence or falling to other invaders. The economy of the ancient world, already fragile, collapsed entirely. Cities that had relied on Roman grain went hungry. Markets that had relied on Roman coins went silent. The network of commerce and communication that had bound the empire together for centuries frayed and snapped. In the markets of Rome, silence replaced trade. Merchants who had once dealt in silk and spices now dealt in bread and water. The wealth of the empire, concentrated in the hands of so few for so long, evaporated like dew in the morning sun. The Visigoths marched south with their plunder, but they found no rest. Alaric died before the year ended, struck down by fever somewhere in Calabria. His people buried him in a riverbed, diverting the water to hide his grave, then killing the slaves who had dug it to keep the location secret. They buried their king and their hope in the same grave. Without Alaric, they were leaderless. Without Rome's gold, they were no wealthier than before. They had won a battle and lost a war they did not know they were fighting. They moved north again into Gaul, into Hispania, searching for land and peace and finding only more struggle. The victory at Rome had not saved them. It had only bought them time. Rome endured, but it endured as a shadow. The population continued to decline. The aqueducts fell into disrepair. The great buildings stood empty. Weeds grew in the forums. The Senate met less and less frequently, until eventually it did not meet at all. The emperors in Ravenna issued edicts that no one read and commands that no one followed. The Western Empire fractured into a dozen petty kingdoms, each ruled by warlords who called themselves Roman, but governed like tyrants. The Dark Ages were not a sudden fall, but a slow dimming, and it began here in the ruins of a city that had believed itself eternal. For those who lived through it, the fall of Rome was not a historical event. It was personal. It was the loss of everything familiar. It was the end of the world as they understood it. They had been raised to believe that Rome was eternal, that the empire was invincible, that the gods favored them above all others. They had been taught that Rome was civilization, and everything beyond its borders was chaos. Now Rome was chaos and civilization was a memory. They had to rebuild their understanding of the world from nothing. Some managed, some did not. Some went mad with grief and disbelief. Some found faith in the Christian God and believed that the fall was divine punishment, that Rome had been judged and found wanting. Some simply stopped believing in anything at all. In the countryside, far from the city, life continued much as it always had. Farmers planted and harvested. Shepherds tended their flocks. Villagers gathered in the evenings and told stories by firelight. For them, the fall of Rome was distant news, important but abstract. They had never seen the city. They had never walked its streets or marveled at its monuments. They had paid taxes to Rome and received little in return. They had been subjects of the empire, but they had never been Romans. For them, the fall was less a tragedy and more a changing of the guard. One set of rulers had fallen. Another would rise. The land remained. The seasons remained. Life remained. But in the cities, in the places where Roman culture had taken deepest root, the fall was apocalyptic. Libraries were abandoned. Schools closed. The complex machinery of Roman law and administration collapsed. Knowledge was lost. Records were destroyed. The great achievements of Roman engineering and architecture were left to decay. The roads crumbled. The aqueducts leaked. The forums filled with rubble. The statues weathered and fell. The inscriptions faded. Within a generation, much of what Rome had built was forgotten. Within 2 generations, it was legend. Within 3, it was myth. The Christian church survived where the empire did not. In the chaos that followed the fall, the church became the only institution that still functioned, the only authority that still commanded respect. Bishops became more powerful than governors. Priests became more important than soldiers. The Pope in Rome, once a minor figure in the imperial hierarchy, became the most powerful man in the city and eventually the most powerful man in the West. The church preserved what it could of Roman culture, copying manuscripts, maintaining schools, building new structures on the foundations of the old. It was not Rome, but it remembered Rome. It kept the memory alive when everything else was forgotten. The barbarians who inherited the empire tried to preserve it. They called themselves Romans. They used Roman titles. They minted coins with Latin inscriptions. They governed according to Roman law, or what they remembered of it. But they were not Romans, and they knew it. They were playing dress-up in the ruins of someone else's civilization, trying to inhabit a role they did not fully understand. Some succeeded for a time. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Hispania, the Franks in Gaul. They built kingdoms that lasted centuries, kingdoms that preserved fragments of Roman culture and law. But they were not the empire. They were its children, born from its death. Rome itself survived, diminished but unbroken. The population continued to shrink. By the 6th century, fewer than 50,000 people lived within walls that had once held over 1 million. The great monuments stood empty, used as quarries for new construction. The Colosseum was stripped of its marble. The temples were converted into churches. The forums were plowed under and turned into fields. Cattle grazed where senators had debated. Goats climbed the steps of the Capitoline. The city became a ghost of itself, haunted by the memory of what it had been, but it did not die. Through the Dark Ages, through the invasions and plagues and famines that followed, Rome endured. It endured because it was more than a city. It was an idea. It was the idea that civilization was possible, that order could be imposed on chaos, that humanity could build something greater than itself. That idea survived the fall of the empire. It survived the Dark Ages. It survived in the minds of monks copying manuscripts in cold monasteries. It survived in the hearts of peasants who still told stories of the glory of Rome. It survived in the dreams of kings and emperors who claimed to be Rome's heirs. The fall of Rome did not happen in a day, but if it had to be dated, if history required a single moment to mark the end of the ancient world, it would be the 24th of August, 410, when the Salarian Gate opened and the Visigoths entered the city and the illusion of Roman invincibility shattered forever. That was the day the empire revealed itself to be mortal. That was the day the eternal city admitted it could end. That was the day history turned a corner and left the ancient world behind. For the people who lived through it, the fall was not history. It was life. It was terror and chaos and loss. It was the smell of smoke and the sound of screams. It was the sight of flames climbing the walls of buildings that had stood for centuries. It was the weight of grief for a world that was gone. They did not know they were living through a turning point in history. They only knew they were living through the end of everything they had ever known. They buried their dead. They tended their wounds. They tried to rebuild. They tried to survive. That was all anyone could do. The Visigoths moved on. They found no rest, no homeland, no peace. They wandered through Gaul and Hispania, fighting other barbarians, fighting Romans, fighting each other. They won battles and lost wars. They settled in Hispania eventually, building a kingdom that lasted 3 centuries before falling to the Moors. They converted to Christianity. They adopted Roman law. They became Romans in everything but name. They forgot they had ever been anything else. The memory of the sack of Rome faded from their histories, replaced by legends of kings and saints and martyrs. They became part of the story they had once tried to destroy. Rome itself never recovered its former glory. The Western Empire limped on for another 66 years before the last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a barbarian general who did not even bother to take the title for himself. The empire ended not with a battle, but with a bureaucratic dismissal, a quiet acknowledgement that the fiction had become unsustainable. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, endured for another 1,000 years, calling itself Roman long after Rome itself had faded into obscurity. But it was not the same. It spoke Greek, not Latin. It worshipped in churches, not temples. It was Byzantine, not Roman. It was something new built on the bones of something old. The dark ages that followed were not dark because knowledge was lost, though much was. They were dark because the light had gone out. The light of certainty, the light of order, the light of the belief that the world made sense and that civilization would endure. For centuries after the fall, the people of Europe lived in a world that seemed to be ending, a world where invasions and plagues and famines came in waves, where life was short and brutal and uncertain. They looked back at Rome and saw a golden age, a time when the world had been ordered and safe and prosperous. They forgot the slavery and the cruelty and the corruption. They forgot the inequality and the wars and the suffering. They remembered only the glory, because the glory was all they had left. Rome became a legend. It became the standard against which all other civilizations were measured. It became the dream of every king who wanted to unite Europe, from Charlemagne to Napoleon to Mussolini. It became the model for every empire that followed, from the British to the American. It became proof that civilizations could rise to unimaginable heights and that they could fall just as far. It became a warning and a promise, a reminder of what humanity was capable of building and what it was capable of destroying. The ruins remained. For centuries they remained. The Colosseum and the Pantheon and the aqueducts stood as monuments to a vanished world, slowly decaying, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Vines grew through the cracks in the marble. Trees sprouted from the roofs of temples. Farmers built their houses with stones taken from the forums. The city was cannibalized piece by piece, its past sacrificed to build its future. But the ruins remained, stubbornly refusing to disappear, reminding everyone who saw them that Rome had been real, that the empire had existed, that the glory had been more than legend. In the year 410, on the 24th day of August, the Visigoths entered Rome and the ancient world ended. It did not end cleanly or completely. It did not end with a declaration or a treaty. It ended in fire and chaos and confusion. It ended in the streets of a city that had believed itself eternal. It ended in the hearts of people who had believed the empire would endure forever. It ended not because Rome was conquered, but because Rome had already conquered itself, hollowing itself out from within, replacing strength with appearance, replacing substance with ceremony, replacing justice with corruption. The Visigoths did not destroy Rome. They simply revealed what Rome had become. The last day of the Roman Empire was not a day. It was a process. It was centuries of decay and denial. It was the slow erosion of institutions and values. It was the gradual replacement of civic virtue with private greed. It was the transformation of an empire into a shell, a name without meaning, a promise without substance. The Visigoths did not cause the fall. They simply witnessed it. They simply pushed on a structure that was already collapsing and watched it come down. For those who lived through it, the fall was the end of the world. For those who came after, it was the beginning of a new one. The Dark Ages were not an ending but a transition, a painful, chaotic, destructive transition from one age to another. From the ruins of Rome, Europe emerged. From the chaos of the fall, the medieval world was born. It was not a better world. It was not a worse world. It was simply different. It was a world that had to build itself from nothing, that had to rediscover what had been lost, that had to create new institutions and new values to replace the old. The memory of Rome survived. It survived in the languages of Europe, in French and Italian and Spanish and Romanian, all children of Latin. It survived in the laws of Europe, based on Roman principles of justice and property. It survived in the architecture of Europe, in the domes and arches and columns that echoed Roman designs. It survived in the dreams of Europe, in the endless attempts to recreate the unity and order Rome had once provided. It survived because it had to, because the alternative was chaos, because humanity needed to believe that civilization was possible. The fall of Rome was not the end of history. It was a chapter in history, a particularly dramatic and painful chapter, but only a chapter. Life continued. People continued. They built new cities and new empires. They created new art and new literature. They fought new wars and made new discoveries. They forgot Rome and remembered Rome and forgot it again. They used Rome as a lesson and ignored the lesson. They praised Rome and condemned Rome and tried to imitate Rome and tried to avoid Rome's mistakes and made them anyway. The 24th of August, 410, was the day the illusion died. The illusion that Rome was eternal. The illusion that the empire would last forever. The illusion that civilization was inevitable and irreversible. That illusion died in the streets of Rome, in the smoke and fire and chaos of the Visigoth sack. It died in the hearts of the people who watched their city burn and their empire crumble. It died in the realization that everything ends, that nothing is permanent, that the greatest achievements of humanity are as fragile as the people who create them. But the truth survived. The truth that civilization is possible. The truth that order can be built from chaos. The truth that humanity is capable of greatness, even if that greatness is temporary, even if it is imperfect, even if it eventually falls. Rome fell, but the idea of Rome endured. The empire died, but the dream of empire survived. The city burned, but the memory of the city remained, a reminder of what had been and what could be again. The last day of the Roman Empire was the first day of everything that came after. It was the day Europe began, born in fire and blood in the ruins of something greater. It was the day the ancient world ended and the medieval world began, violently, chaotically, without ceremony or plan. It was the day history turned, and nothing was ever the same again. The Visigoths marched into Rome, and they marched into legend. The Romans watched their city fall, and they watched the world change. They did not know what was coming. They could not imagine the centuries of darkness that followed, or the Renaissance that eventually emerged from that darkness. They only knew that the world they had known was gone, and they would have to find a way to live in the world that remained. The smoke rose from Rome for days after the Visigoths left. It rose into the summer sky, visible for miles, a signal to the world that something had ended. Travelers on the road saw it and turned back. Ships in the harbor saw it and did not dock. The provinces saw it and understood that they were on their own now, that Rome could no longer protect them, that the empire was a fiction they would have to abandon. The smoke rose and dissipated and left only the smell of burned wood and stone and flesh, the smell of endings. In the ruins, life continued. It continued because it had to. Children were born, crops were planted, bread was baked, water was drawn. The Romans who remained in the city did what humans have always done in the face of catastrophe. They adapted. They found new ways to survive. They built new lives from the wreckage of the old. They buried their dead and mourned their losses and kept going because there was nothing else to do. Rome had fallen, but the Romans had not. They endured, diminished but unbroken, a people without an empire, citizens of a city that was no longer the center of the world. The Visigoths scattered across Europe, their moment of victory fading into memory, their treasure spent or lost or stolen. They became a footnote in history, remembered only for the destruction they caused, not for the desperation that drove them to it. They were painted as barbarians, as savages, as the destroyers of civilization, when in truth they were refugees, survivors, people without a home trying to find a place in a world that had no room for them. History is written by the victors, but in the fall of Rome there were no victors. There were only survivors. The empire's treasury, looted and emptied, would never be refilled. The wealth that had sustained Rome for centuries was gone, scattered across battlefields and barbarian camps, melted down and reforged, spent on survival and war. The economy that had bound the empire together collapsed under its own weight, under the burden of corruption and debt and inflation. The coins that had once carried the face of emperors became worthless metal, their value eroded by the reality of scarcity. In the markets, famine replaced abundance. In the forums, silence replaced debate. In the palaces, emptiness replaced power. The soldiers who had defended Rome, who had stood on the walls and fought in the streets, were left unpaid and forgotten. Some became bandits, some became mercenaries, some simply went home, if they still had homes to return to. They had fought for an empire that no longer existed, for a civilization that had already ended. They had bled for nothing. They had died for nothing. Their sacrifice was not remembered because there was no one left to remember it. The empire they had served was gone, and with it went their purpose and their honor and their place in the world. The Dark Ages were not a time of ignorance. They were a time of forgetting. They were a time when the knowledge of Rome was lost, not because it was destroyed, but because there was no one left to teach it. The schools closed, the libraries burned, the manuscripts crumbled. The language itself changed, evolving from classical Latin into a dozen regional dialects that would become the languages of modern Europe. The continuity was broken. The connection to the past was severed. For centuries, the people of Europe lived in the shadow of Rome, surrounded by ruins they could not understand, speaking languages they did not know were descended from Latin, following laws they did not know were based on Roman principles. But the fall of Rome was not the end of civilization. It was the end of a civilization. It was the end of the ancient world, with its certainties and its cruelties, its glories and its horrors. It was the end of an age that had believed in empire and conquest and the inevitability of Roman dominance. It was the beginning of something new, something that would eventually become the medieval world, and then the Renaissance, and then the modern world. The fall was a transition, painful and destructive, but necessary. The old had to die so the new could be born. On the 24th of August, 410, the sun rose over Rome, and the city did not know it was the last morning of the world it had built. By nightfall, that world was gone. The walls still stood, the monuments still stood, but the empire was finished. The illusion was shattered. The eternal city had proven itself mortal. Rome had fallen, not with a whisper but with a roar, not quietly but in fire and blood and chaos. It had fallen, and the world would never be the same. The ruins remained. They remain still 2,000 years later, a reminder of what was built and what was lost. The Colosseum stands, the Pantheon stands, the aqueducts carry no water, but they still span valleys and cross rivers, monuments to an engineering prowess that would not be matched for 1,000 years. The ruins are a testament to human ambition and human folly, to the heights we can reach and the depths to which we can fall. They are a warning carved in stone. Nothing lasts forever. The people who fled Rome in those first weeks carried with them only what they could bear. They left behind fortunes and heirlooms and the accumulated wealth of generations. They left behind the proof of their status, the symbols of their power, the material evidence of their place in the world. They became refugees, indistinguishable from the barbarians they had once despised, wandering roads they had once owned, begging for shelter in towns that had once paid them tribute. The reversal was complete. The mighty had fallen. The proud had been humbled. The Romans, who had conquered the world, had lost everything. In the provinces, the news of Rome's fall arrived slowly, carried by merchants and soldiers and refugees. In some places, it was greeted with shock and disbelief. In others, with satisfaction and relief. The provinces had borne the weight of empire for centuries, had paid its taxes and fought its wars, and received little in return. Now the empire was broken, and they were free. Free to govern themselves, free to keep their own wealth, free to forge their own destinies. The fall of Rome was their liberation, even as it was Rome's tragedy. But freedom came with a price. Without Rome's legions to defend them, the provinces were vulnerable. Invasions came in waves: Saxons in Britain, Franks in Gaul, Vandals in Hispania and Africa, Huns in the east. The barbarians who had once feared Roman power now sensed weakness and moved to fill the vacuum. The provinces that had celebrated their independence found themselves fighting for survival. Some succeeded, some did not. The map of Europe was redrawn in blood. The Christian bishops who had once been persecuted by Rome now became Rome's inheritors. They preserved the administrative structures the empire had built. They maintained records and collected taxes and dispensed justice. They became the only authority that still functioned, the only institution that still commanded loyalty. The Pope in Rome, who had been a minor figure under the emperors, became the most powerful man in the West. The Church became the empire, or the closest thing to it. It inherited Rome's ambition and Rome's arrogance and eventually many of Rome's vices. Power corrupts, whether held by emperors or priests. The art of Rome decayed with its buildings. The sculptures weathered and cracked. The mosaics lost their tiles. The frescoes faded in the sun and rain. The skills that had created them were lost. For centuries, no one in Europe could build a dome like the Pantheon's. No one could engineer an aqueduct like Rome's, No one could carve marble with the grace and precision of Roman sculptors. The knowledge was gone, and with it went the beauty. The medieval world built churches, but they were crude and dark compared to Roman temples. They built castles, but they were fortresses, not palaces. They built for survival, not for glory. The aesthetics of an age reflect its priorities, and the priorities of the Dark Ages were simple: stay alive. Trade routes that had once connected the Mediterranean collapsed into isolated local markets. The grain that had fed Rome from Egypt no longer arrived. The olive oil from Hispania, the wine from Gaul, the precious metals from Britain, the spices from the East, all of it ceased. The economy fragmented into 1,000 small subsistence communities, each producing only what it needed to survive. Money lost its meaning when there was nothing to buy. Barter returned. Services were exchanged for goods. Lords were paid in crops and labor, not in coin. The sophisticated financial systems of Rome, with their banks and loans and investments, disappeared. Debt disappeared. Credit disappeared. The future disappeared, replaced by an eternal present where each day was concerned only with that day's survival. Inflation, which had already crippled the late empire, became irrelevant in a world without money. The empire had debased its currency for centuries, adding less and less precious metal to its coins, trying to stretch its dwindling reserves. The result had been predictable. Prices soared, wages stagnated, and the poor starved while the rich hoarded gold. The fall of Rome ended the inflation by ending the currency. When there are no coins, there can be no debasement. When there is no trade, there can be no speculation. The economy of the Dark Ages was primitive, but it was also stable. People knew where they stood. They knew what they had. There was poverty, but there was also certainty. The libraries of Rome, those great repositories of knowledge, were abandoned or destroyed. The Library of Alexandria, which had survived for 700 years, would fall to fire in the centuries after Rome's collapse. The libraries in Rome itself were looted for their precious metal bindings, their pages used as kindling or left to rot. Manuscripts that represented centuries of scholarship, philosophy, poetry, and science were lost forever. The plays of Sophocles, the histories of Livy, the natural histories of Pliny, the letters of Cicero, most survived only in fragments, copied by monks in cold scriptoriums, preserved by accident rather than design. The knowledge of the ancient world, which had been freely available in Rome's public libraries, became the jealously guarded possession of the Church. But knowledge has a way of surviving, even when civilizations do not. The monks who copied manuscripts did so, not because they understood their importance, but because copying was a form of worship, a discipline, a way to serve God. They copied everything they could find, pagan and Christian alike. They preserved Virgil alongside the Bible. They preserved Aristotle alongside Augustine. They did not always understand what they were copying. Sometimes they made mistakes. Sometimes they censored passages they found offensive. But they copied, and because they copied, the knowledge survived. When Europe finally emerged from the Dark Ages, when the Renaissance finally dawned, the knowledge was there, waiting to be rediscovered. The Senate of Rome, which had once ruled the known world, met for the last time in the late 5th century. There was no formal dissolution, no grand ceremony. The senators simply stopped coming. The forum where they had met for 1,000 years fell silent. Grass grew between the paving stones. The Senate House, the Curia, was converted into a church. The Statue of Victory, which had stood in the Senate chamber since the time of Augustus, was removed. The debates that had shaped the fate of millions were replaced by prayers. The Senate had become irrelevant long before it officially ended, but its end marked the final death of the Roman Republic, which had been dead in all but name since the time of Caesar. The concept of citizenship, which had been Rome's great innovation, disappeared with the empire. Under Rome, citizenship had been a legal status that granted rights and protections. It had been something that could be earned or inherited, something that bound people together across vast distances. In the Dark Ages, there were no citizens, only subjects. People belonged to lords, not to states. Loyalty was personal, not political. The bonds that held society together were feudal, oaths of service, grants of land, promises of protection. It was a simpler system than Rome's, but also more brutal. In Rome, a citizen could appeal to law. In the Dark Ages, a peasant could appeal only to his lord's mercy. The roads of Rome, those magnificent highways that had bound the empire together, fell into disrepair. Without maintenance, they crumbled. Rain eroded them. Frost cracked them. Vegetation reclaimed them. Within a century, many were impassable. The network that had allowed armies to march from Britain to Mesopotamia, that had carried trade goods and news and ideas across half the world, dissolved into mud and rubble. Travel became dangerous and slow. The world contracted. People lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. The horizons narrowed. The cosmopolitan world of Rome, where a merchant could walk from Londinium to Jerusalem speaking the same language and using the same coins, gave way to a patchwork of isolated villages where strangers were feared and foreigners were enemies. The fall of Rome changed language itself. Latin, which had been the universal tongue of the empire, fragmented into dialects. In Gaul it became French. In Hispania, Spanish and Portuguese. In Italy, Italian. In Dacia, Romanian. Each region developed its own version, shaped by local influences and barbarian invasions. The grammar simplified. The vocabulary shifted. The pronunciation changed. By the 8th century, a speaker of classical Latin would have struggled to understand the Romance languages that had evolved from it. The linguistic unity of Rome was gone, replaced by diversity. It was a loss, but also a gain. The Romance languages were more flexible than Latin, more capable of expressing new ideas, more alive. They were not corruptions of Latin. They were its children, grown beyond recognition. In the countryside where most people lived, the fall of Rome was less catastrophic than in the cities. Farmers still farmed, shepherds still tended flocks, seasons still turned. The rhythm of rural life, which had remained largely unchanged for millennia, continued largely unchanged. The tax collectors stopped coming, which was a relief. The soldiers stopped requisitioning supplies, which was a blessing. The roads might be dangerous, but peasants rarely traveled far anyway. For the rural poor, the fall of Rome meant less interference, not more chaos. They had never benefited much from the empire. Its disappearance did not impoverish them, but the cities suffered terribly. Without trade, they could not feed themselves. Without empire, they had no purpose. The great urban centers of Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, Rome itself, shrank dramatically. Alexandria, which had been the second city of the empire, declined from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands. Carthage, rebuilt by Rome after its destruction in the Punic Wars, was sacked by the Vandals and never recovered. The cities became depopulated. Buildings were abandoned. Infrastructure collapsed. The urban civilization that had been Rome's greatest achievement dissolved. The Dark Ages were an age of villages, not cities. Urbanism would not return to Europe for centuries. The Visigoths, having sacked Rome, found themselves no better off. They had gold and silver and treasures beyond counting, but they had no land. They continued to wander, continued to fight, continued to search for a homeland. Alaric's death left them leaderless and divided. His successor, Ataulf, led them into Gaul, where they clashed with other barbarian groups and with the remnants of Roman authority. Eventually, they settled in Aquitaine, in what is now southern France, where Rome formally ceded them territory in exchange for military service. They became federates of the empire, allies rather than enemies. It was what Alaric had wanted from the beginning, what he had marched to Rome to demand. The sack had been unnecessary. It had accomplished nothing. It had simply destroyed. The Gothic kingdom in Aquitaine lasted for a century before being conquered by the Franks. The Visigoths moved south into Hispania, where they established a kingdom that lasted 3 centuries. They converted from Arian Christianity to Catholic Christianity. They adopted Roman law and Latin as their administrative language. They married into Roman families and became in time indistinguishable from the people they had conquered. They became Romans, just as the Romans had once conquered and absorbed countless other peoples. The cycle of conquest and assimilation, which had built the empire, now continued without it. Rome's legacy was not in its institutions, which had failed, but in its culture, which endured. The Eastern Roman Empire, which would come to be called Byzantium, survived the fall of Rome and would survive for another 1,000 years. Based in Constantinople, speaking Greek rather than Latin, it was everything the Western Empire had failed to be: stable, wealthy, defensible. It preserved Roman law and Roman administration. It maintained a professional army and a functioning bureaucracy. It controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia and grew rich on customs and taxes. But it was not Rome. It did not rule from Rome. It did not speak Latin. It did not even call itself Byzantine. It called itself Roman, but it was Roman only in name. It was something new, a hybrid of Greek culture and Roman institutions and Christian theology. It was the heir of Rome, but it was not Rome's resurrection. Justinian, the Eastern emperor who reigned in the 6th century, attempted to reconquer the West and restore the empire. His generals succeeded in retaking Italy, North Africa, and part of Hispania. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might be restored, but it was an illusion. The conquests were costly and could not be maintained. Justinian's wars bankrupted the East and left Italy devastated. The Lombards invaded shortly after his death and took most of the peninsula. The dream of restoration died with Justinian. The empire could not be put back together. Too much had changed. Too much had been lost. The world had moved on. In the rubble of Rome, Christians built churches on the foundations of temples. The Pantheon, which had been dedicated to all the gods of Rome, was converted into a Christian church and thus survived when other temples were destroyed or abandoned. The Temple of Antoninus and Faustina became the Church of San Lorenzo. The Curia became Santa Maria Antiqua. The new religion claimed the old sacred spaces and made them its own. It was a practical choice as much as a spiritual one. The buildings were there. They were solid. They were already associated with the divine. Why build new structures when old ones could be repurposed? The Christians did what they had always done. They adapted, they survived. They took what was useful from the world around them and made it serve their purposes. The Pope, who had been a relatively minor figure in the age of emperors, became the dominant power in Rome after the fall. With no emperor in the city, with no senate to challenge him, the Pope became Rome's ruler, in fact, if not in name. The bishops of Rome had always claimed spiritual authority over all Christians. Now they claimed temporal authority as well. They governed the city. They negotiated with barbarian kings. They crowned emperors and deposed them. The Papal States, which would dominate central Italy for over 1,000 years, were born from the vacuum left by Rome's fall. The Church became what the empire had been, an international power that transcended local loyalties, a source of unity in a fragmented world. But the Church was not Rome. It did not build roads or aqueducts. It did not maintain armies or collect taxes efficiently. It did not promote trade or learning or the arts, at least not at first. The early medieval Church was concerned primarily with salvation, not civilization. It saw the fall of Rome as divine judgment and the Dark Ages as a time of trial before the second coming of Christ. It preserved knowledge, but it did not create new knowledge. It maintained order, but it did not promote progress. The Church was a conserving force, not an innovative one. It would be centuries before it would sponsor the great cathedrals and universities that would eventually lead Europe out of darkness. The memory of Rome became something malleable, something that could be shaped to serve whatever purpose was needed. For the Church, Rome was the city of martyrs, the place where Peter and Paul had died, the spiritual capital of Christianity. For the barbarian kings, Rome was the source of legitimacy, the place where emperors had been crowned, the symbol of authority. For scholars, Rome was the repository of lost knowledge, a golden age to be studied and emulated. For peasants, Rome was a fairy tale, a place of impossible grandeur that had existed long ago if it had existed at all. Everyone remembered Rome differently. Everyone claimed Rome's legacy. No one agreed on what that legacy was. The Franks, under Charlemagne, would attempt to restore the Western Empire 3 centuries after its fall. On Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor, reviving a title that had been dead for 300 years. But the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire, as Voltaire would later observe. It was a German kingdom that claimed Roman ancestry, a political fiction designed to legitimize Charlemagne's rule. It bore no resemblance to the Roman Empire. It did not control Rome for most of its history. It did not speak Latin. It did not unite Europe. It was a ghost wearing Rome's name, and everyone knew it, yet the attempt itself was significant. See, it showed that Rome still mattered, that the memory of empire still had power. For 1,000 years after its fall, every ambitious ruler in Europe would claim to be Rome's heir. The Byzantines claimed it by geography and continuity. The Holy Roman Emperors claimed it by papal coronation. The Russian Tsars claimed it as the Third Rome after Constantinople fell. Even Napoleon in the 19th century would style himself as a new Caesar. Rome's physical power was gone, but its symbolic power endured. The idea of empire, the dream of unity, the hope of a world at peace under a single law, these were Rome's true legacy, and they survived when everything else was lost. The Dark Ages were not uniformly dark. There were periods of relative stability, brief renaissances, moments when it seemed civilization might recover. Charlemagne's reign was one such moment. The Ottoman dynasty in the 10th century was another. But these were islands of light in a sea of darkness. Between them were centuries of invasion and plague and famine, centuries when human life was, in Hobbes's famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. Life expectancy plummeted after Rome's fall. Trade declined. Literacy declined. Population declined. Europe in the year 1000 was poorer, smaller, and more ignorant than Europe in the year 400. The fall had consequences that lasted for generations, but eventually Europe recovered. The Renaissance began in Italy in the 14th century, in the ruined cities of the Roman heartland, where the physical remains of antiquity were most visible. Scholars began to study the ancient texts the monks had preserved. Artists began to imitate ancient sculptures. Architects began to copy ancient buildings. The humanists of the Renaissance believed they were reviving classical civilization, that they were restoring what had been lost in the Dark Ages. They were wrong. They were not reviving Rome. They were creating something new, something that used Rome as inspiration, but was fundamentally modern. The Renaissance was not a rebirth. It was a birth, the birth of the modern world. The fall of Rome teaches us that nothing is permanent. Not empires, not civilizations, not even the greatest achievements of humanity. Everything ends, everything decays, everything dies. The Romans believed their empire would last forever. They carved those words into stone, Roma Eterna. Eternal Rome. They were wrong. Rome was not eternal. It was mortal, as all human creations are mortal. It rose and it fell, and it left behind ruins and memories and lessons that we have spent 2,000 years trying to understand. But the fall of Rome also teaches us that endings are not absolute. Civilizations fall, but people survive. Empires crumble, but culture endures. Rome fell, but the Romans became Italians and French and Spanish and Romanians. The empire died, but the Latin language lived on in its children. The institutions collapsed, but the ideas survived. The physical power of Rome was destroyed, but the symbolic power of Rome remains with us even now. 2,000 years later, every time we speak a Romance language, every time we use Roman numerals, every time we invoke Roman law or Roman ideals or Roman examples, Rome fell, but it never completely died. The last day of the Roman Empire was the 24th of August. In the year 410, when the Salarian Gate opened and the Visigoths poured in, and the illusion of invincibility shattered. But it was also every day for centuries before that, every day when corruption went unpunished, when justice was denied, when the powerful exploited the weak, when the empire chose appearance over substance, when Rome betrayed the ideals that had made it great. The fall did not happen in a day. It happened over generations, so slowly that no one noticed until it was too late. And it happens still. Every time a civilization grows complacent, every time an empire believes itself invincible, every time power corrupts and wealth concentrates and justice fails, the seeds of Rome's fall are sown again. We have not learned the lesson. We build our own Romes and believe they will last forever, and are shocked when they do not. We make the same mistakes. We ignore the same warnings. We tell ourselves that this time will be different, that our civilization is stronger, that our walls are higher, that our enemies are weaker. We are wrong. We are always wrong. Nothing lasts forever. The smoke that rose from Rome in August 410 has long since dissipated, but the ruins remain. They stand in the heart of modern Rome, surrounded by traffic and tourists and the noise of contemporary life, monuments to a vanished world. The Colosseum where gladiators fought, the Forum where senators debated, the Pantheon where gods were worshipped. They are no longer functional. They are museums now, relics, curiosities, but they still stand. They still remind us. They still testify to what was built and what was lost. The last day of the Roman Empire was not the end of history. It was not even the end of Rome. It was simply the end of an age, the closing of a chapter, the transition from one world to another. Civilizations rise and fall. That is their nature. What matters is not how long they last, but what they leave behind. Rome left behind laws and languages and buildings and ideas. It left behind a model of governance and a dream of unity. It left behind art and literature, and engineering marvels that still impress us 2,000 years later. It left behind proof that human beings are capable of greatness, even if that greatness is temporary. On the 24th of August, 410, the sun rose over Rome, and the city woke to its last day as the center of the world. By nightfall, that world was gone. The Visigoths had come and gone. The fires had burned and been extinguished. The smoke had risen and dispersed. The dead had been left where they fell. The survivors had emerged from hiding and begun the long, painful work of survival. Rome still stood, but it was not the same Rome. It was smaller. It was broken. It was mortal. The eternal city had proven itself temporary. The empire had revealed itself as fragile. The illusion had died, and with it died an age. But from those ruins, something new would eventually grow. Not immediately, not quickly, but eventually, the Dark Ages would give way to the medieval world. The medieval world would give way to the Renaissance. The Renaissance would give way to the modern world. Each age built on the ruins of the last, learning from its mistakes, preserving its achievements, trying to do better. Trying and sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, but always trying. That is what human beings do. We build, we fall. We rise again. We are mortal, but we are also resilient. We are temporary, but we are also enduring. The last day of the Roman Empire was August 24th, 410. It was a day of fire and blood and chaos. It was a day of endings and beginnings. It was the day the ancient world ended and the medieval world began. It was the day Rome fell and Europe was born. It was the day an empire died and a memory was created that would last for thousands of years. It was not the end. It was a transition. It was history turning, as history always turns, from what was to what will be. The Visigoths entered Rome. The Romans fled or hid or fought. The city burned. The empire fell. And the world moved on, as it always does, indifferent to empires and their pretensions, caring only for the endless cycle of creation and destruction that is human history. The ruins still stand. The memory still lives. Rome still matters, not because it was eternal, but because it tried to be. Not because it succeeded, but because it dared. Not because it lasted forever, but because it lasted long enough to leave a mark that 2,000 years have not erased. That is the legacy of Rome, not its power, which is gone, not its glory, which is faded, but its ambition, its attempt, its refusal to accept limits or admit defeat until defeat was absolute and undeniable. Rome fell, but Rome mattered, and that is enough.